We're celebrating Be Rich. It's so cool to hear from Kirk and Jocelyn about the work that they are doing and the way that the Lord is using them to serve and make a difference. And last week, Colin kicked off our Be Rich, inaugural Be Rich week with this idea that giving reminds us of God's grace. And so we gave generously. And I want us to look again at this text that Colin introduced us to last week as we transition from the idea of giving to the idea of serving. It's 1 Timothy 6, verse 17 and 18. And it says this: "Teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others." And we were blown away as a staff by your generosity, by the way that you gave generously, by the way that we modeled not putting our trust in our finances. And so if giving reminds us of God's grace, then serving reminds us of Jesus's humility. And that's what we're going to see this morning, and that the basis of our intention to serve, the basis of our expectation to serve from Jesus is his own humility. Because generosity is about so much more than money. It's about the time that you have to serve the people around you. It's about the energy that you have to give and to serve. And it's about the abilities that God has given you to uniquely bless the people around you. I bet you wish that it was just about money, right? It can be so much easier to write a check. But Jesus calls us to something so much better, even if it's so much harder. If you have your Bibles, turn to Matthew chapter 20. We'll have it on the screen. And I want to catch you up on where we're at in the biblical narrative. The Gospels are the first 4 books of the New Testament. See, the Bible is just a collection of books written by different authors in different genres. And the Gospels are all collections of stories about Jesus. And they tell us about his birth, but most of all, they tell us about the 3 years of his life where we see his public ministry to people. It's how he interacted, it's what he said, where he went, and what he did. And 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, were written by friends of Jesus, people who traveled with him. And then Luke, which happens to be my favorite gospel, was written by a Greek doctor who studied and interviewed dozens of eyewitnesses to develop his account and to write this book about Jesus. And so the Gospels just tell us stories about Jesus, and we're going to look at one of them this morning. Now you know where Matthew is at as far as biblical text, but now let me catch us up on where we're at in Matthew chapter 20. There are 28 chapters in the book of Matthew, and chapter 20 is at the start of what we call Passion Week. And that's the last week of Jesus' life. So like I said, Jesus had 3 years of ministry, and Matthew 20 we find at the start of his final week. And this is what he says. This is what Matthew says. As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside privately and told them what was going to happen to him. Now, what it means when it says he took them aside privately was that Jesus didn't just travel around with the 12 disciples. There were hosts of people that traveled with him throughout his 3 years on earth, a number of men and women. We see hints of this throughout the Gospels, but it's said explicitly in Luke chapter 8. It lists a number of women who traveled with Jesus during his ministry. But there are moments where Jesus takes the 12 aside. Growing up, I always thought it was just Jesus and the 12. It blew my mind when I learned that there was a whole group of people that went with Jesus nearly everywhere during this ministry. And so Jesus takes the 12 disciples aside, and he says this. "Listen," he said, "we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and to the teachers of the religious law. They will sentence him to die. Then they will hand him over to the Romans to be mocked, flogged with a whip, and crucified. But on the 3rd day, he will be raised from the dead." Here's this intimate moment where Jesus allows his disciples to enter in with him. And this was the 3rd time that Jesus prophesied his death. We see the other accounts earlier in the book of Matthew. And so the Son of Man was a title that Jesus used to talk about himself. The disciples would have no mistake. There would be no question who Jesus was talking about. And now, after prophesying twice before, he says, now we are going into Jerusalem. It's about to happen. It's the start of this week. And wouldn't you imagine that the disciples in this moment would have a somber reality of what they were walking into? Don't you think they would have a reflective humility of, man, Jesus, our best friend, our leader, just told us what's about to happen, like right now? You would think, right? But instead, something else happens. It says, then, now the mother of James and John, one of the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons. We see in the New Testament that the mother of James and John was one of the women that traveled with Jesus. So we can only deduce that after Jesus has this little convo with the 12, James and John are like, Mom, guess what Jesus just told us? Like, it's about to happen right now. Now, James is not the same James that wrote the letter to James that we see in the New Testament, but John is the same John who wrote the book of John, one of the other Gospels, and he also wrote the letters 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, okay? So a different James, same John, and they're brothers. And it says their mom comes to Jesus with her sons. Now, we don't know if the mom, if it was her idea to have this conversation with Jesus, or maybe it was James and John kind of got their mom to do their bidding. But look at what happens. She knelt respectfully to ask a favor. This is where the cringing begins. This is what Jesus says. What is your request? She replied, in your kingdom. They knew that Jesus had a different kingdom. In your kingdom, please let my 2 sons sit at places of honor next to you, one at your right and the other at your left. But Jesus answered, saying to them, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering that I am about to drink? No, they can't. They say, oh, yes, we are able. Jesus told them, you will indeed drink from my bitter cup, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. My Father has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen. What a horrible conversation for James and John to have in this moment, right? I mean, like, try and imagine that. Jesus, best friend, leader, rabbi, you believe that he is the Messiah, that your entire heritage has prayed for and waited for. And he says, now is the time. We are about to go into Jerusalem where I will be crucified. And they say, oh man, he's going to die in about a week. We better secure our places like before he's gone. And so James and John go, and they have a perceived authority, right? The disciples had an authority because they walked with Jesus, right? They were set apart. People knew that they were disciples. And so they take this opportunity, they take this authority, and they try to use it for their own gain. It's so painful to read, but I think it's such a picture of what happens to us, right? In our culture. Isn't that what we see? Get ahead no matter the cost. It doesn't matter who is under you. It doesn't matter. As long as you can gain authority, then you'll be superior to the people around you. So when the other 10 disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. And you would think their indignation would come from, like, man, you guys missed it. Like when you hear a coworker ask a question and you're like, oh, no, that was bad, right? You would think that their indignation would come from a frustration at how much James and John had missed it. But it doesn't. It comes from a jealousy that they didn't ask first. It reminds me of when I was a little kid and I have 2 brothers and a sister. And so when we would want to ask something from our parents, maybe to have a friend spend the night, we knew that if me or my sister were having a friend over, the boys couldn't have a sleepover the same night and vice versa. And so it was always that game of who's going to ask first and who's going to get it, right? And so you would wait, like you don't want to ask too early because then they'll say no, but you don't want to wait until your siblings ask because then you're done. And so I imagine sitting in a living room and hearing my brother say, hey, Mom, I was wondering. And I get up and run into the kitchen. Hey, I was wondering if I could have a friend spend the night. Like trying to get it out first, right? Because you're just upset. Or if you hear that conversation happen, you're upset because you didn't get it first. You didn't get what you want. And this is what I imagine the foolishness of the other 10 disciples. Not indignant because James and John missed the point. Indignant because they weren't able to be elevated themselves. It's so foolish. And Jesus would have every right to wield his power, to use his authority to snap the disciples into line. He would have every right, after sharing something so vulnerable, so intimate, to rage at the disciples. You've missed it. Really, guys? 3 years? 3 years, and this is what you're after, is your own power, your own glory? But instead, Jesus calls the disciples to something so much different. And he models so beautifully in this passage what he says in this text. It says Jesus called them together. I imagine such grace, such humility. He's not angry that they missed it. He's not indignant, even though he has the right to be. And he uses this opportunity to teach them, to love them well, and to call them to something better. He gives them this profound thought on authority and leadership and servitude. This is what he says. You know that the rulers of this world lord it over their people, and their officials flaunt their authority over those under them. It's brilliant, right? Instead of Jesus acknowledging what the disciples themselves were doing, he allows them to see what they disdain in other people, and he calls their attention like, this is what you're doing. He says, you know that that's how the rulers of this world do it, but among you, it will be different. For whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many. But among you, it will be different. You know, I think if we had to sum up a lot of Jesus' teaching, especially as it relates to the Jewish people that he was a part of, that he grew up in as a rabbi, so much of what he explains and relates to them is this phrase, among you, it will be different. It will be different than you've always done it. It will be different than you expect. And then even as Jesus relates to the Greeks and to the Gentiles, he says, among you, it will be different. Don't do it the way your rulers do it. Don't do it the way those who have power and authority to wield do it. Among you, it will be different. I love that. I love how many translations render it not so with you. I love allowing that refrain to play in my mind when I want to wield my authority, when I want to use the power that I have to do what I want. I remember what Jesus modeled for us. Not so with you. Because Jesus offers us a better way. You see, with the Gentiles and with the rulers of this world, and if you continue reading in Matthew, you see even with the Pharisees and the scribes, the leaders in the Jewish community, in Matthew 25, there's a list of woes, and it says that they do it wrong too. And he says this, between the two, Jesus offers a better way, because with Jesus, authority does not equal superiority. Authority does not equal superiority. And I think we might agree with that, but if you look at your life and the way that you lead, the way that you interact with the people with whom you have authority, I wonder if superiority is at play. I wonder if you were to release all of the superiority and to embrace what Jesus offers, how much would change? Because if Jesus, the King of all kings and the Lord of lords, if Jesus, the one with ultimate authority and ultimate power and ultimate everything, the one who has the power to breathe galaxies into existence, to craft us into his image, if he chose not to wield his authority and to use it to coerce other people, what right do we have to do that? No, Jesus offers us a better way. We see in Philippians 2, verses 5 through 8, Colin read this last week also. It says that Jesus, though he was God, did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. And when he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. You see, serving reminds us of Jesus' humility, because when Jesus had every opportunity to use his power, he chose instead to serve. I think this text in Philippians 2 and what we see of Jesus in Matthew 20 reminds us that humility and servitude is not just action. It's not just what we choose to do, but it's our attitude as well. Like it says in Philippians 2 that Jesus did not think equality with God something to cling to, when he had every right, every ability, and every authority to do so. He chose a better way. So what does an attitude or action of service looks like? I think it looks like Romans 12, verse 10, that says, outdo one another in showing honor. Think about that. Think about the people in your life, whether it's a spouse, a child, a sibling, whether it's a boss or a coworker, a teacher, or a classmate? What if your mentality was not, how do I have the authority to force my hand in this situation? But what if instead it was outdo one another in showing honor? A competition honor, like we're Canadians, like you go first, no, you go first, no, you go first, right? To outdo one another in showing honor. Or I think of Ephesians 5, verse 17. It says this, be filled with the Spirit. I have all of these words highlighted because I want you to see that there is one verb, there's one command in this passage. It's called an imperative, it's an action, and that is to be filled with the Spirit. Everything else is just a reflection of what it looks like to be filled. Addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. This word submission is this idea of service. And if you were to put an image with this word submit, I would want you to imagine walking up to a door right at the same time as someone, and you can't both go through, so someone has to step aside, right? Someone has to go first. And to submit is to let another go first. To serve is to choose not to wield your authority even when you have it. You see, if you don't have the authority and you serve, then that's cool, but that's not the point, right? The point is that when we have authority, when we have the ability to choose ourselves, when we have the ability to exalt ourselves, we choose instead to humble ourselves and to serve. And the way that Jesus approaches this text, this idea that Jesus gives us, is not inferiority. Because if the opposite of superiority is inferiority, one might think, well, Jesus doesn't want us to be superior to others, and so we're inferior. But that's not the point. The point isn't inferiority, it's humility. It's stepping aside and letting another go first. The basis that Jesus uses is simply himself. In this text, he says, for the Son of Man. Now, the last time he was saying that was when he was talking about the Son of Man going into Jerusalem to be crucified. And now, in an act of humility, in a desire to teach and to help his disciples become better, he says it this way. He says, no, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, the one who had every right. No, he came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. No, church, we have the opportunity to choose not to wield our authority, even when we could, even when we've been taught to, even when that's all we've ever seen, even when we don't want to serve because that person never serves us, and if we serve them, then we'll think doesn't matter. We're called to serve because the Son of Man, who gave his life as a ransom for us, calls us to serve something much harder and much better. So what I want to challenge you to consider this morning is who, how, and where God might be calling you to serve. Who are the people that God has put around you? It could be just a spouse. It could be a spouse and a boss. It could be you're the boss and everyone's under you and you have no idea what it would look like for you to serve them, for you to make yourself humble before them, for you to allow them to go first. Or maybe in your marriage, you're just cringing like, man, we're not in a good spot and I don't want to start with serving. I don't want to start by submitting myself because you don't know what we've been through. And man, I know that you've been through it. But Jesus, the one who has given us everything, the one who has given his life as a ransom for many, says, trust me, this is the better way. This is the better way. Some of the options that we have as you consider who and how God has equipped you to serve, some specific giftings and opportunities that you can use to be a blessing, not just to our church, but to our community as a whole. And then where are those opportunities? One option that we have to recommend to you is to coach a sport at the Y. Maybe you've been gifted with a special ability that many people are not, to coach, to serve in an athletic way. Not many of us have it. I mean, I do, obviously, 5'3". I'm going to coach basketball this year, but many people don't, right? So how has God equipped you to serve? To coach a sport at the YMCA. We'd love to connect you with that. A Jobs Partnership is a ministry that Colin talked about where you can help mentor and develop people in the job force. We have someone in our church who serves as a mentor right now and would love to connect you with that. And then another option, if you're just really not sure how God's gifted you or what you could do or what you want to do, we would love to develop you. And we love that one of the truest things about our church is that we are not built on the talent of a few, but on the contributions of many. And anything that you are a part of at our church, it does not take just our staff team. If it were just our staff team, we would be crumbling, right? It is a host of volunteers, and we love the privilege to help develop you, to help you find your spot. So we would love to connect you if you feel the Lord prompting you to serve. You see, last week we saw that as God's grace, as our giving reminds us of God's grace, it causes us to give generously. And if serving reminds us of Jesus' humility, then we are called to serve sacrificially. As we encounter the greatness of God and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, when he chose to do what no one else could do, what he didn't have to do, when he could have used his power, he served. And so as we're reminded of Christ's humility, would you be encouraged to serve sacrificially? Y'all, we are stepping into Thanksgiving week where you're going to have uncomfortable conversations, awkward family members, long hours sitting in a living room because that's just what you're supposed to do. And my challenge to you would be not to wield your power and not to use your authority, not to do it the way the people of this world do it, but to do it differently. Let it be true that it would not be so with us. Among us, let it be different. Let's pray.